My name is Richard Caldwell. I'm in my early 40s now, old enough to understand patterns, young enough to still feel the weight of regret. For most of my life, I've been the kind of man people describe as steady, reliable, low maintenance, the one who doesn't make scenes or ask for much. If you asked my coworkers, they'd tell you I was dependable but forgettable. If you asked friends, they'd say I was kind, quiet, and a little emotionally distant, someone who always seemed fine. What most people never notice is that being underestimated can become a habit that other people lean on. When you don't protest, when you don't demand attention, the world gets comfortable assuming you'll absorb whatever is inconvenient for them. This isn't a story about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or painting myself as the victim. It's about consequences, quiet ones, the kind that arrive slowly after all the noise has faded. I left my wife alone during her depression. Now I spend my evenings talking to empty rooms. It's paired with the truth I avoided for years. I chose comfort over commitment when she needed me most, and solitude is the only thing that stayed loyal to me. I'm not telling this story to justify myself. I'm telling it because for a long time, I convinced myself that silence was neutrality, that doing nothing was the same as doing no harm. I believed that if I wasn't actively cruel, I was still a good man. I was wrong. This story follows a long emotional arc, not a dramatic explosion. It moves through neglect that didn't look like neglect at the time, through small decisions that felt reasonable in the moment, through the slow reassignment of roles inside a marriage, until one day, the role I thought was permanent quietly disappeared. You won't hear shouting here. There's no villain monologue, no sudden twist of fortune. What you'll hear instead is the anatomy of distance, how it forms, how it hardens, and how it outlives love. You'll hear what it's like to realize too late that absence can be louder than betrayal. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm offering honesty, because there are people listening right now who believe that staying quiet keeps the peace, that withdrawing is the same as being patient, that love can survive on autopilot. This is what happened when I believed that. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently, without judgment. Have you ever assumed someone else would endure what you didn't want to face? For a long time, I believed I knew exactly who I was to the people around me. I was the dependable one, the man who didn't forget birthdays, who paid bills on time, who showed up when something broke and quietly fixed it. At work, I was the person managers trusted with unglamorous problems. Not the visionary, not the loud achiever, the stabilizer, the one who kept systems running so others could shine. At home, that identity followed me like a uniform I never took off. To my wife, Emily, I was solid. That was the word she used most often when people asked about me. Solid. Not passionate, not emotionally expressive, just solid. At first, I took pride in that. In a world full of volatility, being solid felt like virtue. What I didn't understand then was how easily solid becomes synonymous with self-sufficient, and how quickly self-sufficiency turns into invisibility. I wasn't ignored outright. That would have been easier to notice. Instead, I was assumed. My presence was treated like infrastructure, important, but only noticeable when it failed. If I didn't complain, it meant I was fine. If I didn't ask, it meant I didn't need. If I stayed quiet, it meant I agreed. And I stayed quiet often, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned early on that expressing emotional need felt like a liability. Growing up, I watched my father withdraw whenever things got heavy. He didn't leave. He didn't explode. He simply became smaller in the room. I absorbed that lesson without realizing it. Strength meant containment. So I contained myself. When Emily and I married, I told myself that love didn't need constant narration. I showed up. I worked. I made sure our life functioned. That had to count for something. And for a while, it did. Or at least, it seemed to. People around us saw us as balanced. She was expressive, creative, and emotionally open. I was calm, grounded, and practical. Opposites that made sense. Friends joked that I was the anchor, and she was the sail. I smiled when they said it. Anchors don't move much. They're not supposed to. But anchors also don't get thanked unless the ship nearly drifts away. Inside our marriage, my role became quietly defined without discussion. I handled logistics. She handled emotions. If something needed to be felt, processed, talked through, that was her domain. If something needed to be fixed, paid, or organized, that was mine. It worked until it didn't. The strange thing about being underestimated is that it rarely feels cruel. It feels efficient. People stop checking in because they assume you're okay. They stop asking because you've never said no. They stop noticing because you've trained them not to look. I trained everyone well. When Emily's moods began to change, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, I didn't register it as a shift that required me to adapt. I registered it as something temporary, something she would process because she was always better at processing. I told myself I was giving her space, that I wasn't crowding her with solutions or questions. In reality, I was maintaining my comfort. I was still being who I had always been to them: reliable, quiet, uncomplicated. The man who didn't demand emotional labor from others. The man who could be left alone without consequences. And that was the most dangerous part. I had made myself easy to leave alone. Not unloved, not unwanted, just unattended. At the time, I thought that meant I was strong. I thought restraint was maturity. I thought silence was respect. I didn't realize that relationships don't decay from one dramatic act of cruelty. They erode from patterns that feel reasonable while they're happening. This part of the story isn't about blame. It's about context, about understanding the role I occupied before anything visibly broke. Because you can't understand what I lost or what I became without first understanding how invisible I allowed myself to be. The first time it happened, I didn't label it as anything important. That's the nature of small cuts. You only notice them later, when they've already healed incorrectly. Emily and I were sitting at the kitchen table one evening, plates pushed aside, the quiet hum of the dishwasher filling the space between us. She had been talking about her day, her voice low, tired, threaded with a kind of frustration I'd heard before, but hadn't learned to decode yet. I listened, nodded, and offered the occasional practical suggestion. That was my instinct. Fix what can be fixed, organize what feels chaotic. At one point, I said something simple. I don't even remember the exact words now. It was something like, "Maybe you're taking on too much. You don't have to carry all of it alone." She didn't look up, just shook her head slightly and said, "You wouldn't get it." It wasn't said sharply. There was no venom in it, just dismissal, casual, almost reflexive. I paused, not visibly, internally. I remember thinking I should respond, ask what she meant, push back gently. But the moment passed. The dishwasher clicked off. She stood up to rinse her plate. The conversation moved on. And so did I. Or at least that's what I told myself. But something about that sentence stayed with me. You wouldn't get it. Not, you don't get it. Not, I need you to understand. Just a quiet assumption that my inner world wasn't worth accessing. That I existed adjacent to her experience, not inside it. To anyone watching, nothing had happened. If I'd mentioned it to a friend, they probably would have shrugged it off. People say things when they're tired, when they're overwhelmed, when they don't have the energy to explain themselves. That's what I told myself too. I told myself she was just exhausted, that this wasn't about me. Pressing the issue would only make things heavier for her. I chose patience, or at least I called it that. But patience can be a disguise. After that night, moments like it began to surface, small, easy to rationalize. She'd stop mid-sentence when I entered the room, then say, "Never mind, it's not important." Or she'd vent to her sister on the phone for an hour, then tell me she was too drained to talk. When I offered help, she'd smile faintly and say, "It's okay, I've got it." Each time, I accepted the answer at face value. I didn't want to be the man who demanded emotional access. I didn't want to make her feel like she had to perform her pain for me. What I didn't realize was that by stepping back every time, I was teaching her something too. I was teaching her that I could be bypassed. The first small cut wasn't the words themselves, it was my reaction to them, or rather, the lack of one. I filed it away as insignificant, even though my body remembered it. There was a tightening in my chest I couldn't quite name, a sense of being slightly misaligned, like a picture frame hanging crooked on the wall. I adjusted myself instead of the frame. Looking back, I can see how easy it would have been to address it then. A simple, "What do you mean by that?" A pause long enough to signal that the comment mattered. But I was committed to being low friction, to be the man who didn't add weight to an already heavy situation. So I let it slide. And because I let it slide, it slid again and again. That's the quiet danger of early dismissals. They don't announce themselves as warnings. They arrive as reasonable moments, wrapped in context and fatigue and good intentions. They only become significant when you realize how often they've been repeated and how rarely they've been challenged. Everyone else ignored that first small cut because it was invisible to them, but I remembered it, not consciously, not as a grievance, but as a shift, a subtle reclassification of who I was allowed to be in her inner life. I didn't confront it, I didn't name it, I absorbed it. And absorption, I would learn, has a limit. By the time I noticed the pattern, it already felt normal. That's how normalization works, not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual lowering of expectations. You don't wake up one day and accept less. You accept a little less every day until less becomes the baseline. After that first small cut, there was no dramatic change in our marriage. We still ate dinner together. We still shared a bed. We still laughed at the same dry jokes, watched the same shows, and planned the same practical future. From the outside, nothing was wrong, and that made it easier to convince myself that nothing was wrong. But inside our conversations, something had quietly narrowed. Emily began speaking to me in summaries instead of stories, outcomes instead of processes. It's handled instead of I'm struggling with this. When I asked questions, she'd answer politely but briefly, as if translating something too complex to bother fully explaining. I told myself this was respect for my time, that she didn't want to burden me, that she knew I had a demanding job and didn't want to add emotional weight to my evenings. That explanation felt generous, mature, reasonable. It was also incomplete. There were moments when the dismissals became sharper, though still subtle enough to excuse. If I disagreed with her interpretation of something, an interaction with a friend, a family conflict, she'd say, "You always see things too logically," or, "This isn't something you can spreadsheet your way through." They weren't insults, not really. They were character assessments, quiet reminders of where I supposedly lacked range. And each time, I nodded. Sometimes I even smiled. I didn't want to be defensive. I didn't want to turn her pain into a debate. I believed that love meant letting someone define the emotional terms. What I didn't consider was how often those terms excluded me. Disrespect doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like efficiency, skipping you in the conversation because involving you feels unnecessary. Sometimes it looks like condescension dressed as self-awareness. Sometimes it looks like being spoken around instead of spoken to. And when you've built your identity around being easy to live with, you cooperate. I rationalized my silence in dozens of ways. I told myself this was a phase, that depression narrows people's capacity, and I didn't want to make her condition about my feelings. I told myself that pressing for inclusion would be selfish, that I needed to be patient, stable, and understanding. I confused endurance with virtue. There were nights when I sat beside her on the couch while she scrolled on her phone, visibly distant, and I thought about reaching for her hand. Sometimes I did. Sometimes she squeezed back. Other times, she didn't notice at all. When she withdrew, I withdrew a step further, giving space before she asked for it, anticipating her needs so she wouldn't have to articulate them. That felt loving. It felt attentive. But it also made me optional. The more I adapted, the less she adjusted in return. Not maliciously, not consciously, just naturally. Humans tend to lean away from effort when something requires none. And I required very little. I stopped bringing up my own frustrations altogether. They felt trivial compared to hers. I stopped correcting small mischaracterizations of my intent. It didn't feel worth it. I stopped asking to be included in emotional decisions. I assumed she knew best. Each concession felt like maturity in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of self-erasure. The most unsettling part is that I wasn't unhappy all the time. I was functional, calm, useful. I told myself that relationships have seasons, and this was simply one that required me to be quieter. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing being sidelined, I was participating in my own marginalization. I wasn't being silenced. I was choosing silence because it felt safer than risking conflict, safer than discovering I might actually be unwanted in those deeper spaces. So I stayed quiet, I stayed agreeable, I stayed helpful. And in doing so, I taught both of us that my emotional presence was optional. That lesson, once learned, is hard to unlearn. Roles don't always get assigned through conversation. Sometimes they're established through repetition, through what's expected of you, and what no one notices when you stop offering. By the time I became aware of mine, it had already solidified. I was the stabilizer, the background constant, the man who made sure life continued to function while emotions moved elsewhere. I handled insurance forms, coordinated repairs, and remembered appointments. I knew which drawer held the spare batteries, which account paid which bill, and which quiet workaround kept things from becoming a problem. None of that required discussion. None of it required acknowledgement. When Emily's depression deepened, my role became even clearer. I wasn't the one she processed feelings with. That space was occupied by her therapist, her sister, and occasionally a close friend. I was the environment in which her healing was supposed to occur. Calm, predictable, unchanging. At first, I told myself this was appropriate, that not every partner needs to be everything, that my steadiness was a contribution in its own right. I leaned into the role because it fit who I believed I was. But roles have gravity. The more you occupy them, the harder they are to escape. When I tried, gently, to step outside of it, the response was subtle, but consistent. If I expressed concern, I was told not to worry. If I expressed confusion, I was told I was overthinking. If I expressed hurt, it was reframed as my discomfort with her illness. That last one stayed with me. "I don't have the energy to manage your reactions too," she said once quietly, after I mentioned feeling shut out. There was no anger in her voice, just fatigue. I nodded. Of course. Her energy was limited. Mine, apparently, was not. That moment clarified something I hadn't wanted to see. My emotional needs had been categorized as negotiable, optional, something to be postponed until a better time that never quite arrived. I wasn't resentful. I was relied upon. And reliance can be a strange kind of invisibility. People don't look closely at what they depend on unless it fails. They assume it will continue to perform as it always has. My calm was assumed. My patience was assumed. My availability was assumed. I started to see it everywhere, in how decisions were made without my input, and how my presence in the room didn't alter the emotional tone. I was thanked for tasks, but not engaged with as a person. It wasn't that Emily didn't care, it was that the role I occupied didn't require her to check in with me emotionally. I was the support structure, not a participant in the experience. And the most uncomfortable realization was this: I had helped build that structure. I had reinforced the role every time I swallowed a feeling, every time I told myself, this isn't the moment, every time I chose ease over honesty. I had made myself so low maintenance that my inner life seemed irrelevant. The world tends to treat you according to the boundaries you maintain. Mine were almost non-existent. There were evenings when Emily would sit across from me, eyes distant, and I could sense she was somewhere else entirely, not with another person, just somewhere internal, closed off. I wanted to ask what it felt like in there. I wanted to be invited in. But I had already taught her that I didn't need that invitation. So I stayed where I was, useful, dependable, quietly removed. That was the role I had been assigned. And worse, the role I had accepted. It took me a long time to understand that being needed is not the same as being known, that being relied upon does not guarantee being valued, and that invisibility, once normalized, rarely announces itself as a problem until something vital has already gone missing. I didn't confront the role. I didn't resist it. I adapted. And that adaptation set the stage for everything that came next. There wasn't a fight, no raised voices, no breaking point anyone else would recognize. The shift happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually disappears from memory. It was a Sunday, gray and unremarkable. Emily had gone out early to meet her sister for coffee. I stayed home, telling myself I'd catch up on emails, maybe fix the loose hinge on the hallway door. The apartment was quiet in a way I had grown used to. Functional silence, not peaceful. At some point, I sat down at the kitchen table with a mug I didn't really want, and opened my laptop out of habit. I stared at the screen without typing anything. That's when I noticed how tired I felt, not physically, but structurally, like something in me had been under tension for so long that it no longer knew how to release. I looked around the apartment. Everything was in order, clean, maintained, predictable. And for the first time, instead of feeling pride, I felt absence. Not loneliness, absence. It occurred to me, quietly and without drama, that if I weren't there, most of this would still function. Maybe not immediately. Maybe there would be small inconveniences, but the emotional atmosphere wouldn't change much at all. That thought didn't hurt the way you'd expect. It clarified. I realized that I had been living as if my value was measured by how little disruption I caused. As if love were something you preserved by minimizing your footprint. I had mistaken self-erasure for devotion. And in that moment, something in me disengaged. Not from Emily, not from the marriage, but from the assumption that this was the only way to be good. I didn't decide anything that day. I didn't make a plan. I just stopped explaining myself internally. I stopped narrating my silence as virtue. I let myself see it for what it was. Avoidance that had been rewarded long enough to feel normal. When Emily came home later that afternoon, she was in a lighter mood. The coffee had helped. She chatted casually about her sister, about a new cafe they'd found. I listened. I smiled at the right moments. I responded appropriately. But I noticed something new, how little effort it took to perform that role, how automatic it had become. I could do it without being present at all. That realization unsettled me more than any argument could have. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling and felt a strange calm, not peace, distance, a subtle emotional withdrawal I hadn't consciously chosen, but didn't resist either. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for managing the emotional temperature of the room. I didn't pull away physically. I didn't become cold or cruel. I simply stopped compensating. Stopped filling in gaps no one had asked me to fill. Stopped preemptively softening myself to fit expectations. Silence, I realized, could be more than endurance. It could be a boundary. Over the next few days, nothing changed externally. I still handled the logistics. I still checked in when appropriate. I still showed up. But internally, there was a shift in orientation. I began observing instead of absorbing. I noticed how often my presence was taken for granted, how rarely my internal state was considered, how easily conversations moved forward without me as an emotional participant. And instead of correcting it, I let it be. Not out of spite, out of clarity. This wasn't a withdrawal meant to punish. It was a recalibration. I needed to understand what would happen if I stopped over-functioning emotionally. If I stopped making myself endlessly available without being invited. What I didn't know yet was that this small internal shift would change the entire trajectory of my life. Not because of what I did next, but because of what I no longer did automatically. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. It didn't feel heroic or tragic. It felt like stepping slightly to the side and realizing you'd been standing in the wrong place for years. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee. After that day, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose. Not in an obvious way. I didn't announce it. I didn't change my tone or my routines. If anything, I became easier to be around, less reactive, more neutral. I removed friction instead of creating it. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, everything was. Before, my silence had been a reflex, an instinct to smooth things over, to avoid becoming another demand in someone else's already crowded emotional landscape. Now, it was deliberate. I noticed when I had something to say, and consciously decided whether it was worth saying. Most of the time, I decided it wasn't. Not because it didn't matter, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't fill the space. At first, Emily didn't notice. Or if she did, she interpreted it the way people usually do, as compliance, agreement, emotional simplicity. When I didn't offer suggestions, she assumed I had none. When I didn't ask follow-up questions, she assumed she'd explained enough. Silence is often mistaken for weakness because it doesn't challenge the existing structure. It lets other people continue exactly as they are. I watched that happen in real time. There were conversations where she spoke at length about her internal struggles, her therapy sessions, her exhaustion, and I listened without inserting myself. I didn't relate it back to us. I didn't ask where I fit into that picture. I didn't volunteer reassurance unless it was explicitly asked for. She seemed relieved. That relief told me more than any argument could have. It told me that my previous efforts, my careful check-ins, my attempts to understand, had been experienced not as support, but as additional weight. By removing myself emotionally, I was making her life easier. That realization hurt, but it also sharpened something in me. I began to see how silence can function as a mirror. When you stop compensating, people reveal what they expect you to provide. When you stop offering emotional labor freely, others show you whether they know how to meet you halfway, or whether they were relying on your quiet endurance all along. At work, the same thing happened. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that weren't assigned to me. I waited to be asked. People assumed I was still tracking everything, still ready to step in if something went wrong. They didn't realize I was watching the system instead of propping it up. Emily began making more unilateral decisions about her schedule, about plans, about things that affected both of us. She wasn't being cruel. She was responding to the version of me I had presented. Adaptable, undemanding, endlessly flexible. When I didn't object, she assumed consent, and I gave it. Not because I agreed, but because I was collecting information. Silence, when chosen consciously, creates space. In that space, patterns emerge. I noticed that when I didn't initiate emotional connection, none came toward me. I noticed that when I didn't check in, no one checked in on me. I noticed how quickly my absence from emotional exchanges went unremarked. That wasn't something I could argue with. It wasn't an interpretation. It was data. The strange thing is that I didn't feel angrier as this became clear. I felt calmer, detached in a way that wasn't numbness, but precision. I was no longer trying to prove my worth through endurance. I was evaluating reality as it was. Emily interpreted my quiet as stability, as a strength, as patience. In some ways, she seemed more comfortable than she had been in months. There was less tension between us because there was less engagement. She mistook my silence for acceptance. I let her, not to punish her, not to trap her, but I needed to understand the truth of our dynamic without my constant adjustments clouding it. Silence stopped being the place where I disappeared. It became the place where I saw clearly. And what I was beginning to see would eventually make staying impossible. Not because of anger, but because of alignment, or rather, the absence of it. I didn't know that yet. I just knew that for the first time, I wasn't shrinking to fit the role I'd been assigned. I was stepping back to see the shape of it. What people rarely understand about quiet men is this. When we stop reacting, we start observing. And observation, sustained over time, becomes preparation. No one noticed when I began paying closer attention. There was no reason they would. From the outside, I was still the same. Calm, cooperative, present. I didn't withdraw socially. I didn't change my routines. I simply stopped filling in emotional gaps that were never acknowledged anyway. That freed up an unexpected amount of mental space. I started noticing patterns I'd previously dismissed as noise, not just in my marriage, but in how my absence or presence altered nothing at all. I noticed how decisions got made without me, and how easily those decisions assumed my compliance. I noticed how my labor, emotional and practical, was invisible until it stopped being automatic. So I began documenting. Not in a dramatic way, not with the intent to build a case against anyone. I documented for clarity, for myself. I kept notes, dates, conversations, moments where I was informed rather than consulted, moments where my needs were acknowledged verbally but deprioritized behaviorally, patterns of engagement and non-engagement, who reached out, who didn't. What surprised me was how consistent it all was. The same people relied on me, the same people bypassed me, the same assumptions repeated themselves without variation. Once I stopped intervening, the system revealed itself. At home, I began to see how much of the relationship functioned on my anticipation. If I didn't remind, nothing happened. If I didn't adjust, discomfort lingered. If I didn't initiate, the connection simply didn't occur. That wasn't a moral failure on Emily's part. It was a structural reality, and structures don't change unless pressure is applied or removed. I also began learning, quietly, deliberately. I read about depression, not just symptom lists, but relational dynamics. How partners sometimes unconsciously outsource stability. How resentment can grow not from neglect, but from asymmetry. How one partner becomes the container, the other the content. I recognized us immediately. I learned about emotional labor, the kind that doesn't get named because it doesn't look like effort. The kind that involves monitoring moods, preempting conflict, and minimizing your own needs to keep things running smoothly. I had been doing that for years, without calling it anything. And once something has a name, it's harder to pretend it doesn't exist. I also paid attention to myself. I felt that when I stopped intervening. There was guilt at first, a sense that I was withholding something essential. But that guilt faded when I realized no one had asked me to provide it anymore. I wasn't withholding, I was just no longer overfunctioning. Emily continued her routines. Therapy, coffee with her sister, occasional social plans. She seemed steadier in some ways, and I was glad for that. I wasn't rooting for her pain. I wasn't waiting for a collapse. I was waiting for recognition. It didn't come. Weeks passed, then months, and in that time, something else happened. I began positioning myself. Again, not dramatically, just practically. I reviewed our finances, not out of suspicion, but awareness. I noted how responsibilities were divided. I made sure I understood the logistics of our shared life independently instead of assuming continuity. At work, I did the same. I clarified my role. I reduced unspoken dependencies. I ensured that if I stepped back, things wouldn't immediately fall apart, but they would be noticeable. This wasn't revenge. It was self-respect, finally expressed through structure. What they never noticed was that I had stopped hoping things would change on their own. Hope had kept me passive. Clarity made me active. I wasn't plotting an exit yet. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was simply aligning my inner understanding with my outer reality. The truth is, when you stop explaining yourself, people assume you have nothing to explain. When you stop asking for inclusion, they assume you don't need it. When you stop offering emotional labor, they assume it was never labor to begin with. That assumption was their blind spot. And in that blind spot, I was quietly preparing, not to win, not to punish, but to be able to choose without fear when the moment came. Because once you truly see the shape of a relationship, staying becomes a decision, not a default. The reveal didn't arrive with shock or triumph. There was no surge of adrenaline, no moment where I leaned back and thought, now I know something they don't. It arrived quietly, the way truths usually do when you finally stopped resisting them. I was reviewing my notes one evening, not obsessively, just methodically. Dates, patterns, small observations written without emotion. When you remove judgment, information has a way of arranging itself. And that's when it became unmistakably clear. I was not central to anyone's emotional life. Not in the way a partner is supposed to be. Not in the way someone whose absence would be felt, rather than merely adjusted for. This wasn't about Emily loving me or not loving me. Love can exist without reliance. This was about something colder and more definitive. I was replaceable in function and already replaced in intimacy. That realization was the leverage. Not power over her, power over myself. For years, my fear had been simple and unnamed, that if I stepped back, everything would collapse, and I'd be responsible. That my steadiness was the only thing holding the structure together. That leaving, even emotionally, would be an act of cruelty. But the evidence said otherwise. The structure wasn't leaning on me, it was leaning around me. Emily had support systems I wasn't part of. Emotional processing happened elsewhere. Decisions moved forward without my input. When I stopped compensating, nothing broke. It simply rerouted. That's when the truth landed fully. I was staying out of obligation, not necessity. Out of habit, not choice. That's a dangerous place to live, because obligation feels moral, even when it's hollow. The leverage wasn't legal or financial. It wasn't some hidden advantage I could deploy. It was clarity, the kind that removes fear from decision-making. I understood finally that I wasn't protecting Emily by staying the way I was. I was protecting myself from the discomfort of acknowledging that the relationship no longer required my full presence. And if my presence wasn't required, then my absence wouldn't be catastrophic. That didn't make leaving easy. It made it possible. There was no celebration in that understanding. No relief. Just a sober calm. The kind that settles in when you've been carrying a weight so long, you forgot what standing upright felt like. I stopped asking myself, what will happen if I step away, and started asking, what is already happening while I stay? The answer was simple: erosion. Slow, polite, unremarkable erosion. I realized then that leverage doesn't always mean the ability to act. It means the freedom to choose not to act without fear of collapse. To know that staying is a decision, not a sentence. That knowledge changed how I moved through the world. I became more deliberate, less apologetic, not cold, just precise. I no longer volunteered emotional reassurance unless it was requested. I no longer assumed responsibility for atmospheres I didn't create. Emily sensed the difference, though she couldn't name it. She'd ask occasionally, "Are you okay?" I'd answer honestly, yes. And I was, because okay no longer meant self-denial. What she didn't ask, and never had, was whether I felt included. That omission said more than any argument ever could. The private reveal wasn't that I had power. It was that I had been free for a long time and didn't know it. Free because my presence had become optional long before I acknowledged it. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The clarity didn't push me toward anger or revenge. It pushed me toward alignment, toward the understanding that staying misaligned out of loyalty isn't noble, it's corrosive. I didn't act immediately. I let the truth settle, let it test itself against time. It held. And in that stillness, I knew the next step wouldn't be reactive, it would be chosen. Clarity doesn't force action. That's one of the myths we tell ourselves, that once you know, you must immediately do. In reality, clarity just removes excuses. What comes next is choice. And choice is heavier than confusion. After the private reveal settled in, I didn't rush toward an ending. I sat with the options instead. I let them line up in front of me, one by one, and I examined each without emotion. I could stay exactly as I was. That option was the most familiar. Continue being the stabilizer, the quiet presence, the man who made life easier by asking for little. There was safety in that, predictability. I knew how to survive in that role. I had been surviving in it for years. But survival is not the same as participation. If I stayed, I would continue to erode. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. I would become a well-maintained shell. Useful, polite, increasingly absent from my own life. I saw that path clearly now, and it terrified me more than loneliness ever could. I could demand change. That option came with scripts I'd rehearsed in my head for years. Long conversations, carefully chosen words, a plea to be seen differently, to be included, to be prioritized again. But once I examined it honestly, I knew the truth. Asking to be valued after you've taught someone you don't require, it rarely creates genuine transformation. At best, it creates a temporary adjustment. At worst, it creates obligation masquerading as intimacy. I didn't want to be accommodated. I wanted to be chosen. And there was a third option, the one I had avoided naming until that point. I could leave. Not in anger, not in protest, but in acknowledgement of reality. That option carried consequences I couldn't soften. It would mean ending a marriage without a villain, explaining a decision that couldn't be summarized neatly, accepting solitude without the comfort of moral superiority. It was irreversible. Once you choose yourself in a situation like that, you can't pretend you didn't know. You can't go back to quiet endurance without betraying something essential. For weeks, I lived at that decision point. I went to work, I came home, I shared meals, I listened, I observed myself as much as I observed the marriage. And I noticed something important. I wasn't hoping for signs anymore. I wasn't waiting for Emily to suddenly turn toward me. I wasn't scanning conversations for evidence that things could be fixed. The part of me that used to negotiate internally had gone quiet. That silence wasn't numbness. It was resolution forming. One evening, Emily mentioned, casually, without malice, that she might spend a few nights at her sister's place the following week. She needed a change of environment, she said, space to think. She spoke as if this were a neutral logistical update. I nodded, said okay, and meant it. That was the moment I understood the decision had already been made. Not because she was leaving for a few nights, but because the idea of her absence no longer destabilized me. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel fear. I felt symmetry. The emotional distance had already been normalized. Physical distance would just make it visible. That night, lying in bed alone, I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine confrontations. I didn't feel righteous. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt aligned. The irreversible choice wasn't dramatic. It was simply the decision to stop living, as if my needs were secondary by default, to stop mistaking endurance for love. Leaving wouldn't make me stronger or better. It would just make me honest. I knew that once I spoke the words, once I named the misalignment, I wouldn't be able to take them back, even if she promised change, even if she suddenly saw me. Because what I needed wasn't recognition born of crisis, it was a presence freely given. And that, I knew now, couldn't be negotiated into existence. So I waited, not for permission, not for validation, just for the right moment to move in a way that matched what I already understood. Once the decision was real, the noise stopped. That's the part people don't expect. They imagine endings as emotional storms. Arguments, confessions, visible unraveling. But when a choice has already settled inside you, action becomes quiet, almost procedural. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't withdraw affection to send a message. I simply began aligning my external life with the internal truth I'd already accepted. Silently. The first changes were administrative, boring, invisible. I reviewed our shared accounts, not with suspicion, just with clarity. I made copies of documents I hadn't looked at in years. Insurance, property records, retirement statements, things I'd always handled passively because we were stable. Stability, I learned, is not the same as permanence. I opened a separate checking account in my name. Not to hide money, just to exist independently again. The act itself felt strangely grounding, like reestablishing a boundary I hadn't realized was missing. At work, I made myself less indispensable. That sounds counterintuitive, but it was deliberate. I documented processes, delegated quietly, ensured that if I stepped away, the system wouldn't collapse, but it would notice the absence. That's the difference between abandonment and exit. One leaves chaos, the other leaves clarity. At home, nothing looked different. I still made coffee in the morning, still asked how her sessions were going, still listened without interrupting. If anything, I was calmer than I'd been in years. Emily didn't suspect a thing. She interpreted my steadiness as reassurance, as proof that things were holding together. That assumption wasn't malicious. It was consistent with the version of me she'd known. I didn't correct it. Silence, at this stage, wasn't avoidance. It was containment. I was holding the reality long enough to transition without emotional damage to either of us. I scheduled a consultation with the lawyer during a lunch break. No drama, no panic, just questions, timelines, options, consequences. Walking back to my office afterward, I didn't feel guilty. I felt sober, grounded in the knowledge that preparation is not betrayal, it's respect for reality. The strangest part was how normal everything felt. We had dinner one night and talked about a show we were watching. She laughed. I smiled. There was warmth, but it was the warmth of familiarity, not intimacy. The kind you feel with someone who knows your routines but not your interior. That distinction mattered now. I didn't rush her sister's upcoming visit. I didn't ask when she'd be back. I didn't fill the silence with reassurances. When she left for those few nights, she hugged me at the door and said, "Thank you for understanding." I nodded. I didn't say, "You don't know what you're thanking me for." Because the truth was, this time, I wasn't understanding her needs at the expense of my own. I was understanding the situation as it was. While she was gone, I walked through the apartment differently, not as a caretaker, as an evaluator. What would I miss? What would I not? The answers came easily, too easily. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt present in my own life for the first time in years. No one noticed any of this because nothing had gone wrong yet. There were no raised voices, no changes in routine, no emotional outbursts to signal danger. That's the nature of moving in silence. By the time others feel it, the ground has already shifted. I wasn't leaving yet, but I was no longer staying by default. And that distinction, quiet, invisible, irreversible, was already reshaping everything. Consequences don't always arrive as events. Sometimes they arrive as absences that don't have names yet. When Emily came back from her sister's place, she seemed lighter, rested. There was a brief optimism in her voice, as if the time away had reset something. She hugged me longer than usual that first evening and said, "It really helped. I think I needed that." I told her I was glad, and I meant it. But something subtle had shifted in how she looked at me. Not an alarm, not suspicion, just a faint recalibration, as if she were checking whether the furniture had been rearranged while she was gone. She couldn't point to anything concrete. That's what made it unsettling. I was still kind, still present, still reliable, but I no longer filled in emotional blanks. I no longer anticipated needs that weren't voiced. When she talked, I listened, but I didn't translate myself into her experience anymore. That absence registered, even if she couldn't articulate it. She began asking small questions. "Are you tired? Work okay? You seem quiet lately." I answered honestly, "I'm fine," because I was. What she was noticing wasn't distress. It was the removal of a constant she'd never realized she depended on. The emotional cushioning was gone. When she grew frustrated one evening and vented about a difficult therapy session, I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't soften the edges of her feelings or redirect them toward optimism. I simply acknowledged them and stayed where I was. She paused mid-sentence and looked at me. "You're different," she said, not accusingly, just observant. I nodded. "I know." That was all. The room felt heavier after that, not because of conflict, but because something unspoken had entered it. A sense that the familiar dynamic no longer operated automatically. Over the next few weeks, I noticed the ripple effects spreading outward. At work, colleagues started double-checking things they'd always assumed I had handled. They asked questions they'd never asked before. My absence from certain processes became visible, not catastrophic, but noticeable. That visibility changed how people interacted with me. I was no longer invisible infrastructure. I was a person whose participation mattered because it wasn't guaranteed. At home, Emily began reaching out more deliberately, asking my opinion, checking my availability before making plans. These were small gestures, but they were reactive, not organic. They came from uncertainty, not connection. I didn't reject them. I responded calmly, but I didn't rush to reoccupy the old role either. I let the imbalance stand long enough to be felt. That's when the discomfort started to surface. She became restless, less certain. There were moments when she seemed to be searching for something, some emotional reassurance that used to be there without being requested. One night, she asked, "Are we okay?" I took a breath before answering, not to prepare a defense, just to be precise. "I think we've been on autopilot for a long time," I said, "and I'm not sure autopilot is working anymore." She didn't argue, she didn't cry, she just sat with that. That was when I realized the consequences had fully begun, not as punishment, but as exposure. When you stop overfunctioning, others are forced to fill the gap, not because you're withholding, but because the system was built on an unspoken imbalance. Emily wasn't losing me yet, but she was losing the version of me who made everything emotionally smoother without asking for anything in return. And she didn't know how to replace that. Neither did I. The house felt quieter now, not emptier, just more honest. Conversations had weight again, pauses lingered longer. This wasn't a collapse, it was recognition, arriving late. By the time she fully understood what she was feeling, the groundwork for change, or separation, had already been laid. Consequences don't always announce themselves with drama. Sometimes they begin as a question no one knows how to answer. The moment people imagine as the wake-up call rarely works the way they think it will. It doesn't arrive with clarity, it arrives with panic. Emily's came gradually, like someone realizing too late that the floor beneath them isn't solid, it's just familiar. She started trying harder, not dramatically at first. Small gestures that felt almost tentative, like she was testing whether the old rhythm could be restored if she stepped back into it carefully enough. She cooked dinner one night, something she hadn't done in months, and asked me to sit at the table while she finished. She asked more questions, lingered in conversations, reached for my hand without looking at her phone. A year earlier, those gestures would have meant everything to me. Now, they felt late. Not wrong, just misaligned. Because what she was responding to wasn't me. It was the absence of the emotional scaffolding I'd removed. She wasn't turning toward my inner world. She was trying to rebuild the structure that made hers easier to carry. And I could feel the difference. There was an urgency in her now, a kind of anxious energy that hadn't been there before. She started asking questions that sounded like concern, but carried an edge of fear underneath. "Are you unhappy? Did I do something? Is this because of my depression?" Those questions weren't invitations to connect. They were attempts to locate the threat. I answered carefully, not evasively, just truthfully. "I don't think either of us has been fully present for a long time," I said one evening, "and I don't know how to pretend that's not true anymore." That was when the confusion set in. She cried, not loudly, not theatrically. Quiet tears that came from not understanding how something could break without a clear moment of damage. She told me she thought we were surviving something together, that she believed my steadiness meant we were okay. And that was the tragedy of it. My silence had protected her from urgency for too long. It had delayed the reckoning until change required more than awareness. It required transformation. She promised she could try harder, be more open, include me more. She asked what I needed. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to answer, because the honest answer wasn't a list of behaviors. It wasn't reassurance or attention or effort. What I needed was not have to teach someone how to see me after years of being invisible by design. That's a terrible thing to realize, because it means love alone isn't enough to reverse time. I told her I didn't want promises made out of fear. I didn't want urgency born from the possibility of loss. I wanted presence that arrived before withdrawal, not after it. She nodded, said she understood, but understanding isn't the same as capability. Over the next few days, the tension grew heavier, not explosive, just dense. Every interaction felt like it was being evaluated for meaning. Every silence felt charged. That's when I knew it was too late. Not because she didn't care, but because the relationship had reached the point where repair would require me to reopen a part of myself I had already closed to survive. And once you close something to protect your core, reopening it isn't an act of love, it's an act of risk. I wasn't angry. I wasn't punishing her. I was simply no longer willing to gamble my sense of self on a dynamic that had already taught me how easily I could disappear. She kept trying, and every attempt only confirmed the same truth. She was reacting to my withdrawal, not responding to who I actually was. The timing was wrong. The effort, though sincere, was driven by panic, not mutual recognition. That's what made it irreversible. You can't fix something at the exact moment someone stops believing it can be fixed. By the time Emily was ready to fight for us, I had already stopped fighting myself. And that realization, the one that comes too late for everyone involved, is the quietest kind of heartbreak there is. When the conversation finally happened, it didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no build-up, no raised voices, no moment where one of us said, "We need to talk." It happened on an ordinary evening after dinner, while the dishes were still drying in the rack. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets when two people know something is coming, but don't want to dramatize it. Emily sat across from me on the couch, legs tucked under herself, hands folded together. She looked tired, but not panicked anymore. The panic had burned off, leaving something heavier behind. Acceptance, maybe, or exhaustion. She spoke first. "I feel like I'm losing you," she said. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to reassure her. I let the sentence exist on its own. "I think," I replied slowly, "that you've been living without me for a long time. This just makes it visible." That landed softly, but it landed. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just nodded, as if some part of her already knew that was true. "I didn't mean to," she said. "I thought you were okay. You always seemed okay." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." There was no accusation in my voice, just clarity. I explained, not in detail, not with a list of grievances, but in shape. I told her how I had learned to make myself smaller to keep things smooth. How silence had become a habit, then a role. I had slowly stopped feeling like a partner and started feeling like a function. She listened without interrupting. That alone told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't resisting the truth. She was recognizing it. "I wish you told me sooner," she said. I believed her, but belief doesn't rewind time. I didn't know how, I said, and by the time I did, I wasn't sure being heard would change anything. She asked then, quietly, almost carefully, "Are you saying you want to leave?" I took a breath, not to steady myself, to honor the weight of the moment. "I'm saying I don't know how to stay without disappearing," I said, "and I don't want to live that way anymore." There was no argument after that, no bargaining, no promises, just silence. Not the old silence, the kind that erased me, but a shared one, heavy, honest. She cried. I didn't stop her, and I didn't retreat either. I stayed present without trying to manage her feelings. That was new for both of us. At one point, she said, "I never meant to make you feel alone." "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't change outcome." That was the closest thing to a hard line I drew. The conversation ended the way it began, quietly. No decisions were finalized that night, no deadlines set, but something had shifted irreversibly. The truth had been spoken without heat, without cruelty, without drama. And once truth exists in the room like that, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. We went to bed separately that night, not out of anger, but necessity. Space wasn't punishment anymore, it was an acknowledgement. The confrontation didn't feel like a rupture, it felt like closure beginning to form. Sometimes, the most decisive moments in a life don't feel powerful at all. They feel calm, like the moment you stop holding your breath without realizing you've been doing it for years. After that conversation, things didn't end immediately. They resolved. Resolution is quieter than endings. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand witnesses. It simply rearranges your sense of self until the old shape no longer fits. Emily and I took time, practical time. We talked logistics without hostility. We gave each other space without theatrics. There were moments of sadness, moments of familiarity that surfaced unexpectedly, but they no longer pulled me backward because something essential had already changed. I was no longer negotiating my worth internally. When I eventually moved out, it wasn't dramatic. A few boxes. A car was loaded in the early morning. A last look around an apartment that had once felt like proof of stability and now felt like a well-maintained archive. Nothing was wrong with it. It just wasn't alive for me anymore. Living alone was quieter than I expected. Not empty. Intentional. Evenings stretched out without needing to be managed around someone else's emotional state. I cooked when I wanted, sat in silence without wondering if it meant something was wrong. And sometimes, yes, I talk to empty rooms. Not out of loneliness, but out of reorientation. When you've spent years narrating yourself internally instead of aloud, it takes time to remember that your thoughts deserve air, your reactions don't need to be pre-approved, that your presence doesn't require justification. I didn't come out of this angry. That surprises people when they hear the story. Anger requires a sense of injustice. What I felt instead was responsibility. Clean, unromantic responsibility for the ways I had chosen comfort over commitment, silence over clarity. I didn't abandon Emily during her depression in a dramatic way. I abandoned the work of being emotionally present because it felt overwhelming, and because I believed my quiet endurance was enough. It wasn't. That doesn't make me a villain. It makes me human and accountable. Who I am now is someone who pays attention earlier. Someone who understands that love without presence is maintenance, not partnership. Someone who no longer confuses being needed with being known. I'm still calm, still reserved, still not loud, but I am no longer invisible by default. If something matters to me, I say it, even if my voice shakes. If something hurts, I name it before it calcifies into distance. I don't wait for permission to exist emotionally, and I don't stay where my presence is optional. Solitude didn't punish me, it clarified me. It showed me that being alone is not the same as being lonely, and that loneliness can exist even in shared spaces when you are unseen. I don't tell this story to absolve myself. I tell it to mark the line between who I was and who I am now. A man who understands that silence is not always grace, that patience is not always love, and that commitment requires more than just staying. Sometimes, it requires the courage to leave without hatred, and to live afterward without bitterness. I still come home to quiet most nights. The rooms don't echo the way people imagine they do when they hear that. There's no dramatic emptiness, no constant ache, just space. Space that reflects whatever you bring into it. Some evenings, I cook and eat slowly. Other nights, I sit on the couch with a book I don't finish. And sometimes, without thinking, I speak out loud. A thought, a reaction, a sentence that never needed to be filtered for someone else's comfort. That's when I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed myself that simple freedom. This story doesn't end with redemption or punishment. No one wins. Emily is still living her life. I hope she's healing in ways that don't require anyone to disappear for her to survive. I don't wish her pain. I don't need her regret. What I needed was honesty with myself first. The moral of this story isn't that you should leave when things get hard. It's not that depression makes relationships impossible, and it's certainly not that silence makes you strong. It's this: love that survives on avoidance isn't love, it's maintenance. And maintenance, over time, will cost you your presence. I chose comfort over commitment, when commitment required discomfort. I chose stability over intimacy, because intimacy demanded risk. I told myself that being steady was the same as being there. It wasn't, and solitude didn't betray me, it revealed me. It showed me that staying quiet to keep the peace doesn't preserve connection, it delays its collapse. That waiting to be invited into someone's inner world doesn't make you respectful, it makes you absent. If there's anything I've learned, it's that the most dangerous moments in a relationship aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet accommodations you make without realizing you're erasing yourself. The times you say, "This isn't worth bringing up." The times you think, "They're dealing with enough already." The times you decide that being needed is enough to feel valued. Those choices feel kind in the moment. They feel mature. They feel loving. Until one day you realize you've trained everyone, including yourself, to live without your full presence. And by the time someone notices, it may be too late, not because they don't care, but because you've already learned how to survive without being seen. I don't regret leaving. I regret not speaking sooner. If you're listening to this and you feel yourself in the background of your own life, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not offering advice disguised as wisdom. I'm just telling you what silence taught me. That peace built on self-erasure isn't peace. That loyalty without presence is just endurance. And that being alone is sometimes the first time you actually arrive. So I'll leave you with one question. No judgment, no instruction, just honesty. Where in your life have you been quietly disappearing and calling it love?